that I've been doing with the LPIP hub as lead, and so I'm just going to pop up my presentation in a moment, except it's now covering my screen, so just bear with me. Okay. So I'm Abby Gilmore. I probably know a few people on the call, and Professor of Cultural Policy at the University of Manchester. And I'm the lead delivery partner, I think is the official title, although I'm not quite sure what that means, for culture, or what was called Culture Recovery, but it's called Culture in Place for the LPIP Strategic Hub. And so what I wanted to just go through today was to give a bit of context to the challenges for local policy innovation partnerships, local partnerships, and places for managing and supporting cultural infrastructure and the kind of access, the amenities, the facilities that people have in their places for accessing arts, culture, heritage, creative expression, creative production. So I'm taking a relatively broad definition of culture here. It means different things at different places. But it also, from the perspective of recent work that I've been doing, is a focus on the kind of more formally supported cultural sector and the kind of institutions, you know, museums, libraries, art galleries, theatres, and other spaces and things like festivals and programmes where people are accessing culture in their localities. So I'm going to say a little bit about the context, and the primary context for me is that I'm just completing a UKRI policy fellowship, which placed me with the National Government Department in Westminster with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport on a placement for 18 months and where I've been doing some primary research. But I'm also going to talk more broadly about the kind of broader context, tell you a bit about some of the findings from that research and how they inform both key challenges for kind of cultural policy really in place and what we might do about them and some next steps that we've got planned in the LPIP hub. Just to say that I can't see my screen at the moment in terms of if anyone's got their hands up or if anyone has put a comment in the chat, so please shout out if you need to interrupt me for any reason. That's fine. I've got some questions for you at the end. So this is a kind of broad, brief statement on the policy fellowship research that I was undertaking over the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, which involved primary research. I was based with a team that was in what has recently changed its name, but was the Culture and Creative Industries Directorate. But I was in an analytical team, which meant that I was sitting with people whose work was really about trying to develop evidence and understand kind of what the context and support evaluations for different policy initiatives and interventions across the culture and creative industries. And my questions were formulated around areas of research interest, which have now starting to change. When I joined as a placement on placement as a policy fellow, it was before the new government and the levelling up agenda was still present. And what I wanted to do with this placement was look into what the implications were for national government that there are so many inequalities, spatial inequalities really, in access to arts and culture across different places, and what the kind of factors and conditions were, what sorts of ways that national policy supports culture from a place-based perspective, and what might be useful things for them to know in order to make better policy, basically. And so you can see the methodology that I use there below. And I'm just going to quickly flick to some of the findings. I undertook 30 interviews in England, Scotland and Wales, but mainly focused in England. And what I tried to do was look at how different practitioners and policymakers at a local level in a range of different kinds of administrative levels, what their experiences were when they were managing either large cultural investment projects that were aimed at placemaking in some way, or when they were trying to attract or just to generally manage their cultural strategies in place. And so I was able to look at a number of different place types, and I was kind of interested in what the distinctions were between different types of places and different types of place governance. And you can see some of the kind of findings that I think are relevant to making sure that the DCMS understand, there are some good things that happen when you invest in place, not just in buildings, but also in kind of programs of work. And you can see that there's an interesting evidence of positive correlation between rising land values, for example. But most of all, I wanted to present the findings from the local perspective in terms of what really helps them to do their work. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on and the kind of implications for LPIP. A bit about the context, which most of us are all horribly familiar with, or all of us probably. So from the perspective of cultural policy, the primary source of revenue for, and thinking about the cultural sector as not just creative industries or commercial businesses, but primarily a lot of non-profit organisations and activities. The primary source of revenue for arts and culture is and has been traditionally local government, and of course with austerity measures we've seen really nearly up to 50% cuts in real terms since 2010. You can see on this slide the kind of different charts that chart the chart of doom, and the one in the middle is the local government expenditure across that period of time, where you can see the dip. There's a slight rise in around the COVID era. The chart on the left-hand side is looking at national funding mix. You can see the complexity of different forms of funds that go into arts and cultural organisations, and the big red block in the middle that goes down significantly is local government. However, it is important to also talk about what national government spends on arts and culture, and the chart on the right-hand side looks at the planned growth in terms of total departmental budgets and also the spending for the DCMS over that, actually a longer time period. And you can see that there's a growth period during the new Labour government. Then we see, austerity really hitting the cultural sector in 2013. But even since this government has come, you can see that there's no planned growth. In fact, there's a decline in cultural funding and spend. So this is a real issue for most formal arts and cultural organisations. And also there's an incredibly complex landscape. The kinds of investments that we've seen into built infrastructure, sort of large capital projects that have come through levelling up have been distributed quite widely, but there's not really been any attention paid to these projects or what the real impacts have been for their places, not least because the DCMS weren't really involved in the decision making for levelling up, and also, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, the way that funding was distributed was according to criteria that doesn't really serve place-based policy. And of course, we've got the context of devolution as well. So I want to turn to that question of how place-based policy might happen from the top down, if you like. And this is just something I found really interesting, this kind of distinction from Martin and all between different types of spatial policies. Spatially targeted policy is the one that you see most of all from national government. Still, I would argue, certainly that's how I saw some of the policy initiatives being framed in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, whereas we might want to see more place-sensitive policy that has an idea of understanding of place and can include and involve place and policymakers within the mix of decision making. And then, of course, the kind of golden the target really being place-based policy, which really involves partnership with local government and more democratic accountability. And there are some examples that I came across in my research of that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. So this is one kind of way of how cultural policy sees place, and on the right-hand side of this slide, we can see that this is from a recent report called, from a piece of work around creative corridors, which was a joint piece of work by the RSA and the Royal Society for Arts and the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, the PEC. And this was a piece of research that I identified and argued for this joining up of different creative industries clusters and centres for where those kinds of agglomerations took place into corridors. And you can see that there are certain areas where in the country across the north we have Tracy Bateman's Mustard Aubergine, as she called it herself, which connects up the northeast with Liverpool. It's similar to the geography of the Northern Way, if anyone remembers those, of course, the Northern Powerhouse. It's an interesting premise for policy that you increase connectivity across these different areas, and that's somehow going to supercharge them. This is very much, of course, in the growth model for thinking about cultural policy and creative industries. How do we want those economic activities to supercharge our, GDP in general? But my question is, what happens if, the policy just focuses on certain areas and the connectivity between those areas? What happens to the areas that are either left behind or fallen below? And I would imagine, although I haven't done the analysis, that on the table on the left-hand side, which is an indication of how the National Lottery Heritage Fund identifies the places that it needs to target funding. I'd argue that a lot of those places are probably in the gaps in between, not just in conurbations, of course, but in rural areas and coastal towns. And I wanted to show you this table because it's quite a good example of how data are used in place targeting. There's quite a sophisticated system or model from the Heritage Fund, which is the Heritage Index, by which they use a range of quantitative measures to kind of rank really the places that they might invest in terms of their need and their opportunity. But importantly, they balance that ranking, those quantitative measures, with with qualitative assessment that draws on their local expertise and regional panels, so that they can really understand those other more qualitative factors. And I think I will argue later on, this is very important for how policy can see place. This is just a quick slide because something that I was thinking about when doing the secondary analysis with the DCMS research was really about that kind of social life of data, and how when you create indices for ranking places or trying to identify the types of trying to identify the evidence for why you should invest or why you should do something somewhere and not somewhere else, then of course you find that there are sort of threshold effects, and there are also other effects from the data, which means that there might not be a true picture, or you basically may have pick the wrong indicators, which quite often happens. So a solution to this came up through the engagement with the LPIP hub and our conferences, and with Marina Ramcharan's work. This is the blog that was from earlier this year, which was looking at data in place, and I've really found a lot of benefit in engaging with thinking through place as a system, and through the kind of way that you might see the system, the dynamics of place through these different place fundamentals. So I'm showing this because it's really I think it's really important to think through in this way, and I'd be really interested if anyone else is in modelling out how different places and partnerships kind of look through this kind of understanding of what place fundamentals and place factors are. And it certainly influenced my thinking with the DCMS research. I wanted to say a little bit about how also I've been framing some of the thinking and in a way that I think hopefully can support a broader understanding of how cultural policy works for arts and culture in place, and that will have meaning for the local policy innovation partnerships. And this is thinking through this idea. Sorry, this is a bit bright, this slide actually. Anyway, it's kind of suffragette colours or something. So social and cultural infrastructure. So there's been some discussion, there's been almost like an infrastructural turn recently. And this is something that I've explored in the DCMS research and then in the report that will be coming out hopefully by the end of the year, hopefully before then. And this is thinking about culture and our access to culture as being supported through cultural infrastructure, and what is the role of the state within this. So so this is more kind of a theoretical framing that I think is really important. One of the big criticisms for national government funding for policy interventions is that, you know, and some of the biggest kind of controversies have been about building new hard infrastructure, venues, flagship buildings, and so on. And it certainly seemed to be one of the kind of tools for culture-led regeneration, is that you build a big theatre and it will come. And certainly many of the people that I was talking to in the DCMS research were funded by what was called the Cultural Development Fund, which was primarily capital investment about improving kind of infrastructure. However, thinking through cultural infrastructure also needs to take into account other forms of infrastructure, and as it says on this very busy slide here, that can include programming, performance, but it also involves the kind of the value change that James and the frameworks through which policy and community and organisations interact with each other. So it has links to thinking through things as ecosystems, and therefore it's also similar to that approach for thinking through place as a system. And more recently, I've also been thinking a bit more about how one of the issues for arts and culture as a sector that has policy interventions is that there's a constant interest in policy in demonstrating what culture can do, whether that's economically, or in terms of health and well-being. So the DCMS are constantly searching for concrete, robust evidence for the kind of the effects of engagement with culture, rather than arts and culture in its own right. And this, I suppose, shows some of the properties of engagement with arts and culture, in that when you take part in the arts, when you take part in culture, when you're involved in whether it's a culture is your language or your everyday kind of participation, that's how we do meaning making, that's how we do identity formation, and there are benefits for our health, and there can be economic benefits. So this is thinking through about culture itself as an enabling property, as a form of infrastructure in its own right. So the way that this has been kind of influencing, well, hopefully you've gathered a sense of how potentially complex the environment is for policy for arts and culture. As I was saying earlier, it's the local government austerity is a huge problem. The economy in general. What of course there is that because culture is discretionary, any arguments locally need to be made on the basis of this, this kind of secondary effects, the impact of cultural interventions on the economy, on social community cohesion, health and well-being, and so on. So it's never something that when your budget needs to really go to health and social care, you're ever going to be able to afford. It's a nice to have. And of course, there are also very disconnected ways. I won't go into it now. That's our kind of cultural policy for our MA students 101. But the complexity of the landscape in England, Wales, and Scotland and Northern Ireland, which all have kind of varied but quite similar in a way relationships between local government, forms of arts council or creative and cultural development agencies. And heritage lottery, and then other funders, including private giving, sponsors, and then of course revenue income. The business model for how cultural policy can operate is really disconnected and difficult, particularly at a local level. If you're in a place that doesn't have existing local capacity, doesn't have a strong set of cultural institutions. Doesn't have a lead local authority that can, or combined authority that can really drive forward the importance of supporting cultural infrastructure. So that there are a lot of challenges. But I wanted to turn quickly, and finishing up soon, to some of the other findings from the DCMS research, and to start to think through how they might be important for what we can find out, what we can learn from our partners in the LPIPs, from the other people involved in the kind of growing network for the that's kind of convened by the hub and the LPIPs, and what that might mean in terms of supporting and developing local policy innovation. What can we do to make cultural infrastructure more sustainable in place? How important is it? So here are some of the findings just from the DCMS research, but particularly strong and particularly important. It seemed to be that where there were those problems around a lack of local government capacity, or little formal public investment, a low export base, as we know from or just economic deprivation in general, where there were those kind of holes in local infrastructure, or where those places had fallen behind, there was really important kind of partnerships that helped to pull them back up again, or help to manage strategic. So I just wanted to do a bit of thinking and ask you some questions about that from your work, and see if we can get a bit of a discussion going about the importance of partnerships and cross-sector relationships. The ones listed here on this slide the Levelling Up Partnership, which was also called the Better Places Partnership, was incredibly important to many of the people that I talked with, because it gave advice from arm's length bodies that was specific to planning standards that helped them to navigate the complexity of local landscapes for the projects that they were involved in. But also, really importantly, those kind of connections into cross-sector partnerships that were held through urban development agencies and through the strategic authorities, and getting a seat at the table was very important. So I talked to a number of the different strategic authorities, and there was some really interesting work going on where they were finding ways to support arts and cultural leaders to be there, and to be heard when it came to making decisions around investment strategies in quite surprising ways, given some of the complexity and economic deprivation of the regions that I was talking with. And an example of this really is the next line around cultural compacts. This is it's a loosely termed thing. It's you can make your compact up as you wish, and it came out of some work on by the Core Cities group on what helps with supporting arts and culture in these difficult times a few years ago. But cultural compacts are basically constituted bodies, but they're not delivery bodies. They're means for kind of convening place and partnership. And the Hull and East Yorkshire one just had a really interesting approach to sort of working with local businesses and getting to sign up to a charter to support their arts and cultural organisations in the region, and also and not just through funds, but also to kind of advocate on their behalf or to find other resources for them. And then there are also really important kind of cross-sector and cross-silo relationships that I came across that were supported through placemaking and through urban planning and cultural planning kind of mechanisms, including cultural planning partnerships. The final thing I wanted to flag up from the findings from the GCMS research was really, and this probably seems obvious when you say it, because places that have fallen behind or fallen below or who struggle to gain further investment or get policy attention with regards to arts and culture. And by the way, all of the figures show that there is extreme disparity and inequality between where public funding goes and also through, there are inequalities through where arts and cultural businesses exist, and they're mainly clustered in particular types of urban geography. So the other thing that I found was really important was where there was other existing infrastructure. So where there is good transport and connectivity, people can move around and people have a sense of freedom. Where there are education institutions, incredibly important, these kinds of place fundamentals, as Marina had for just the mobility of human capital and retaining young people, and for them being a kind of source of engagement with arts and culture or with creative economies. The people that I talked to in places that had not even sixth form colleges or certainly no nearby university, were the places where they found it really difficult to engage with younger people and younger audiences. And of course, other providential infrastructure is really important, as is having a kind of strong policy infrastructure. So just finally now, a quick word on what we're sort of planning, and when I say we, I'm talking about those in the LPIP hub, myself, Sarah Hassan, and Abby Taylor, and others who have got a relationship to this theme, culture in place and communities. One of the things we want to do, well, there are kind of three main priorities that have come through our engagement with the LPIPs and with the LPIP fellows, that we're going to do some further work on. And these are related to the things I've just been talking about in terms of GCMS research. So the idea of community voice, or how communities participate in decision making. And so we are planning to do a bit more of a sort of deeper dive and look at different models for that and think about that in the context of local partnerships. Also, better business cases. As I said earlier, there is kind of a burden, if you like, but a necessity for policy, certainly at a national level, and also for case making at a local level, to make the instrumental case for why we should have access to libraries, museums, festivals, and creative industry support. And that that is instrumental. It's usually framed in the way of what are the kind of economic cost benefits, but there are other ways. So one of the things we want to look at more closely is better business cases for arts and culture at a local level. And then finally, the idea of doing some kind of policy hackathon has come from one of our policy, our place fellows, Val Birchall, in terms of thinking through what kinds of ways that we might support new forms of policy at a local level. How does it work with partnerships? How do we influence and inform national funding streams and national policy levels in all of the devolved nations, not just England? And I should say I've been primarily talking about Westminster and England. I know there are very different models and opportunities in the other devolved nations. So just to so that I can kind of leave these questions with you, I wanted to see if there was any comments or suggestions for these three questions here from your work. You know, so what are the best models for convening plays that gets culture at the table and that supports, you know, what are the best models for partnerships? Are there particular forms of community participation in decision making that we should be aware of and think about? And are there also other policy levers or even planning levers and strategies that specifically work to support more sustainable cultural infrastructure in place? I'm just going to take myself out of the presentation now and hopefully hand it over to you. So are there any comments or questions? Fiona,
yeah,
you've got your hand up.
Thank you. As you noted, this is very focused on urban metropolitan areas, the clusters as well. Do you have any specific examples of more rurally dispersed sort of infrastructure that works from your research?
That works. So you've thrown it back at me. So I think that those points about kind of access to other forms of infrastructure were really notable, particularly in the places that it didn't work. I suppose, yeah, one example was actually there were many examples, and they were prompted by, you know, having the opportunity through quite large scale investment. So I tried to talk to different places and different projects, some which had significant amounts of investment that allowed them to undertake, you know, work over a 2-3 year period, and some that had no investment and were really struggling. And I suppose the best examples that I had in terms of rural or different types of geography, different place types, and connectivity and partnership was there was a cultural development fund initiative called the Creative Estuary, which is sort of along the Thames, and it's a range of different types of places that are kind of connected by this idea of the creative estuary. It sort of mirrors the Thames corridor work, which is an innovation corridor, but it has a specific focus on supporting the ecology around how arts and culture is planned into place, and that's partly because some of the places along that area, the corridor, and there are a number of different towns and local authorities involved in it that I can't remember the names of now, but you can look it up by looking at their website. They formed very specific sort of partnerships that were around how they could inform the planning of new towns. They also created opportunities for young people to get involved and develop skills in working with communities and becoming kind of placemakers. And they actually have put together, finally, after its third attempt, from my experience, a cultural planning toolkit, which goes through some of the processes through which you can gather the right information, support partnership working, work with developers, and work with other stakeholders in, you know, what kind of cultural assets are desired or wanted in, you know, it's basically a way of involving community in decision making and brokering different relationships with those who are investing in place, whether that's developers or public funders or so on, and managing cultural planning, which can both mean planning through the identification of what things are culturally important to place, and also planning for cultural infrastructure. Now, that said, obviously I'm talking about the south east of England here, and the investment was matched. There is a lot of housing development. So if you're talking about rural areas where there aren't those kinds of opportunities for partnership work, then it's a different matter. And certainly some of the places on the coastal towns were particularly found it particularly difficult to kind of compete with other conurbations or other rural areas. So that was one example. I hope that's helpful. And Des? Is
that me?
Yes, sorry, Des.
Oh,
I think you've got your hand
right.
up.
Sorry. I mean, great presentation. Thanks very much, Abby. One of the things that occurs to me, I mean, obviously I'm coming at it from a Scotland perspective, which in a sense is a simpler environment to think about than England or the UK as a whole, is that a lot of this is about policy choice. So, you know, in Scotland, we have national cultural institutions predominantly based in Edinburgh, some of them with links through to Glasgow. But arts institutions in Glasgow are essentially not funded nationally, if I can put it like that. So, you know, we have to fund our own museums and so on. And there is a national approach to diversity, which is about pushing different forms of artistic expenditure to rural parts of Scotland and non-urban centres and to other urban centres in Scotland. I mean, that's a matter of policy choice, but the consequence of that for Glasgow has been a denuding of kind of cultural investment in the city over a number of years, despite the fact that Glasgow is really a site of, you know, cultural education, much more so than other places in Scotland, and there is a stronger arts community. So in a sense, there's a kind of opposition between a policy that focuses on place inclusion and getting arts out to every place in Scotland, and one which actually focuses on promoting growth and excellence in the cultural sector, particularly in places that are not part of the capital city. I mean, I think your research allows you to pull some of those choices to the surface, but what it doesn't do is necessarily force politicians or anyone else to make those choices explicit. And I'm just wondering if there are ways in which the work that you've done kind of, in a sense, frames or can be used to frame choices that are made and make them more a subject of political debate. So we can have a debate about, you know, should you spend money here? Should you spend money there? Is there a fairness within the system? And what kinds of fairnesses are we actually trying to promote?
I think that's really useful. Thank you, Des. And I think it relates to some of the things that I'm hoping we can talk about in relation to better business cases. But there's a question of better business cases for whom, really. I mean, I agree absolutely that these are choices, and they're choices made based on ever depleting resources. So they're always going to be, well, they're more likely to be risk averse. They're more likely to be constrained. And from those that rely on a system of demonstrating that you have, that you've created more bang for buck, then through your investment, then those choices will be not just kind of about can we do quality or can we do quantity. They're much more likely to be framed by that need to demonstrate that they have met the terms for the criteria for government. So they're basically still going to be put through from a national perspective, from the DCMS, they're still going to be assessed on whether they're successful in creating economic value, and I think that constrains the choices. I think Scotland is a great example because it's smaller, and so you can kind of keep it in your purview. You can understand more what's going on there. It has fewer urban conurbations, I think that is really useful about kind of using sort of change. It is something that I want to do in my research, is change the term, change the narrative to what cultural policy should be. And the reason for being interested in how that happens at the place-based level is because that's where you really find out how it is important to people's everyday lives, as it is embedded in what they do, and culture is really foundational in the ways that access to healthcare and education are. So I suppose that the broader project for my work is to kind of change that narrative, but I think that's really useful to think about whether or not there's specific ways that we can not talk about how to trade off between choices, but really get policymakers thinking about what the frames for their choices are. That isn't just between. It used to be in the 1990s and 2000s the choice between access and excellence. I think those days have changed, particularly through institutions like the Arts Council England's kind of strategy that is more place-based and is more around everyday participation, is more around culture and communities. But I take your point. That's really useful. Thank you. We're coming to time. Are there any other questions or hands up or comments that people would want to make quickly? Angela.
I just wanted to ask if you've had any experience of seeing people work with community improvement districts, and if there's any learning from that you could share, because we're looking at doing that in Newtown in Birmingham.
Okay, great. Well, I'm really interested in other work that I've done, which has been about this idea of the creative improvement district up in Greater Manchester. So the GMCA have developed this model, which is less of an actual model. It's not a prescribed thing. It came out of a piece of work that the Centre for Local Economy Study, CLES, did back in the pandemic, and it kind of looked at whether or not you could have a sort of zoned area that might focus people's attention in the context of high street recovery on arts and culture and creative stuff across the 10 boroughs in Greater Manchester. But I did see a good presentation from somebody at the RSA a couple of years ago on the Community Improvement District in London, and I think there are similarities between them. I'm really interested in also the business improvement districts are starting to become a model for potential revenue raising. Sorry, that was a bit of a garbled response. I haven't come across community improvement districts. I'd be really interested in finding out more about the plans for the one in Birmingham.
Great, thanks.
I can see that people have dropped off the call now. We've gone past time. Thanks everyone for your attention, and yeah, hope to see you soon at another of these or at the forthcoming LPIP meetings. Thank you. Bye.